To this event, the Capacity Building Hub. The event is on the enhancing capacity building to promote synergies amongst the Rio Conventions, the multilateral environment agreements. So if we can have the introductory slides of the event. Thank you very much. My name is Alejandro Kilpatrick. I'm the manager of the Capacity Building Subdivision at the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this event, which has as its main objectives to hear about the importance of building capacities to implement synergies amongst the Rio Conventions and with the Sustainable Development Goals, and also to present a joint MEA capacity building program being designed by the secretariats of the 3 Rio Conventions. So we'll hear from representatives from the conventions and a representative from UNDESA. So keynote statements, then we will have a very brief presentation of this joint MEA capacity building program, followed by a presentation, a concrete case study on how to do synergies and implementation of Rio Conventions, a case study from the Caribbean, from Grenada. And then if time allows, of course, we will have an interactive session with questions and answers. Without further ado, please allow me to invite to the stage our colleagues to provide the statements. I would like to invite Daniel Tsegai, who's a representative from the UNCCD. And then we have Bahari Sayedi from UNDESA. And we're waiting for colleagues from the CBD Secretariat. And I will be delivering a statement on behalf of the UNFCCC. So Daniel, Bahari, please join us. Yes, perfect. Okay, so thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to kickstart these statements on synergies with our colleague Daniel from the Secretariat of the UNCCD. Daniel, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for this event. And also, I'm very, very pleased to be here with you representing the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. My name is Daniel Tsegai. I'm a policy officer at the Secretariat leading the drought and water scarcity issues for the Secretariat. And brief words about the UNCCD first. UNCCD is one of the 3 Rio Conventions that was established in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And our focus at the Secretariat is on the sustainable management and restoration of land resources with the aim of improving local livelihoods, but also mitigating the impacts of drought. Healthy land, we all know it, is central to the well-being of the planet's ecosystems and biodiversity, and it feeds us, it shelters us, and it provides the backbone of the thriving global economy. When land is degraded or plagued by drought, it loses its capacity to sustain life, which leads to a range of consequences, including crop failure or to migration and conflict and displacement. So the UNCCD, as we all know it, is the only legally binding framework set up to address desertification and the effects of drought. And in the interest of this joint event today, Article 19 of the Convention says the parties recognize the significance of capacity building, that is, nation building, training, and development of relevant local and national capacities in efforts to combat desertification and mitigate the impacts of drought. So these 3 Rio Conventions are intrinsically linked, operating in the same ecosystems and addressing interdependent issues like biodiversity, climate change, and land. And we believe at the Secretariat, land is the operative link between biodiversity and climate change. Land can be a powerful and cost-effective climate solution. It must be the primary focus of any meaningful intervention to tackle this intertwined crisis of biodiversity and climate change. And restoring degraded land and soil provides the most fertile ground on which to take immediate and concerted action. So at this, just representing my colleague also from the Capacity Building and Innovation Office, we have a capacity building market. We have a very successful cooperation with the two conventions, the exclusive e-learning platform, an extensive internship program, a young scientist program, special events and workshops on particular subjects. We also run a university lecture series. We work with civil society organizations and capacity building organizations. And we are also in the process of developing tertiary courses on sustainable land management and drought resilience. With this, I just want to close my remarks and thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for your statement, and thank you for highlighting the articles in the CCD that showcase or highlight the importance of capacity building. I'm sure all the conventions have similar articles because it's a cross-cutting issue of utmost importance, particularly for developing countries. Please allow me to deliver a short statement on behalf of the Climate Change Secretariat. Unfortunately, Mr. Daniele Violetti, the program director of programs, could not make it because of the negotiations. I'll deliver this statement on his behalf. The interconnected nature of the global challenges that the Rio Conventions aim to address has never been clearer. Global crises such as biodiversity loss, climate change, land degradation, and most recently, a couple of years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic show us that they're all interconnected and share common root causes. These are the same drivers that the Rio Conventions have been addressing for almost 30 years. As mentioned by Daniel, the interconnections are obvious. The biggest interconnection overlap in the work of all the three Rio Conventions is in the field of nature-based solutions. Such solutions refer, for example, to the protection of coral reefs and mangrove forests that protect coastal communities from storms, flooding, and erosion. Measures to avoid cutting down huge swaths of tropical forests are beneficial both for animal and plant life and are crucial for a stable climate, food, and drinking water. Land degradation is not only extremely harmful for biodiversity, but accounts for around 60% of global methane emissions. And methane, we all know, is a powerful greenhouse gas that is released through various unsustainable agricultural practices. Sustainable agriculture and land use is also a shared area of work of all the three conventions and is recognized in the Coronivia Joint Work Program on Agriculture. Another key overlap includes the recognition that societies need to rapidly introduce and scale up the use of clean and sustainable technologies. This applies notably to renewable energy technologies such as wind and solar power. These are key to reducing greenhouse emissions whilst diminishing pressure on land and forest biodiversity by providing alternatives to unsustainable and polluting biomass fuels such as charcoal and others. Efforts to integrate the implementation of the three Rio Conventions together with the Sustainable Development Goals offer great opportunities to streamline processes and deliver transformative results. However, in practice, most projects and policies remain limited in scope and in the level of integration, leading to duplication of efforts, incoherent approaches, and limited overall effectiveness. Therefore, there is a clear need to develop the capacities of domestic policymakers and practitioners to effectively integrate the implementation of the Rio Conventions into development programs, policies and activities aligned with the achievement of the SDGs. Therefore, we believe the main point of impact lies at the domestic level. Thus, policymakers and practitioners at this level should be enabled to explore their own ways of integrating the Rio Conventions. It's in this spirit that the secretariats of the three conventions have joined forces for the design of a joint capacity building program as part of our strategic efforts to enhance coordination and coherence in the implementation of the three Rio Conventions and its connections to the SDGs. This joint capacity building program, which will be presented in a few minutes, aims to strengthen the capacities of relevant national institutions and individual policymakers and practitioners to integrate and foster synergies between the three Rio Conventions and the SDGs. The program would also provide insights to national stakeholders on how different projects can improve the wider implementation of the conventions, as well as the objectives, the Sustainable Development Goals. We know this COP28 will be a milestone as it sees the conclusion of the first global stocktake of the Paris Agreement. And the assessment is clear that while progress is being made in implementing measures to adapt to climate change and mitigate its effects, we're still a long way from being able to limit the increase in global temperature to less than 1.5 degrees. Science tells us that we need to take critical action in this decade, and therefore we need systems transformation, nationally, regionally, globally. We need more climate ambition to accelerate action. We need international cooperation and solidarity to make this transition rapid, fair, and equitable, leaving no one behind. The enhanced synergistic implementation of the MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements, aligned with the SDGs, therefore will be a decisive contribution to this transformation. Thank you very much, and now I have the pleasure of welcoming Mr. David Cooper, who is the Acting Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Please, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you so much. And I think it's clear from all the discussions here at COP28, but also the discussions that took place recently under the Desertification Convention in Samarkand, and of course under the CBD, that really we're looking here at a global crisis where climate change, land degradation, ecosystem degradation, biodiversity loss are all interacting. Many of the drivers of change are common, and many of the solutions are also common. Last year, of course, just short of a year ago in Montreal, parties adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, very ambitious framework to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. It includes very strong targets on, for example, ecosystem restoration to restore or have under restoration by 2030 at least 30% of degraded lands. This, of course, is an essential part of the action needed to address biodiversity loss. It's an essential contribution to climate change action, both mitigation and adaptation. And, of course, it's an essential part of the effort towards land degradation neutrality to combat desertification. Parties, so all three instruments, essentially the same parties, will need, of course, increase in capacity. They need technology transfer. We need technical and scientific cooperation. And that is why, alongside the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, parties adopted a plan on capacity building and development and technical and scientific cooperation, looking also to create a network of institutions for technical and scientific cooperation in support of the implementation of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, and also adopted very strong decisions on cooperation among the Rio Conventions and among the multilateral environmental agreements. We saw a couple of days ago a strong commitment from the UAE presidency here, together with the COP15 presidency of China, to call for integration of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. So countries now, in follow-up to the agreements in Montreal, are developing and updating their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, identifying targets, to national level targets to translate the global framework into the national level. There's a big opportunity to carry out that process in close coordination with national adaptation plans and with the ramping up of the nationally determined contributions, as was just said. And of course also contributing to the plans for land degradation neutrality. Thanks to Colombia and Germany. Under the CBD, a partnership has been launched called the NBSAP Accelerator to provide capacity support to countries. We're working in very close collaboration and learning from the success of the NDC partnership, which similarly has been providing capacity building to parties under the Climate Convention. And of course, we now very much look forward to this to this joint MEA capacity building program, which is going to be introduced in more detail in a little while. It's clear that we'll need all hands on deck as we try to implement the Paris Agreement, ramp up the NDCs, achieve land degradation neutrality, and achieve the goals and targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. In doing so, we need to engage all sectors of society. So it's another major element in terms of capacity building. We really have to do these things together, and so we very much welcome this joint program. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think just be careful. Tristan. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Cooper. We understand you have a busy schedule, and thank you for making time for us to be in this event and for highlighting all the opportunities and the milestones in the different processes that are showing us that this is very timely. This joint capacity building program comes at a very the opportune time. But please allow me to then talk about, give the floor to Bahari Sayedi, who's a representative from UNDESA, because we're talking about this synergistic implementation of the MEAs in alignment with the SDGs, and UNDESA is doing a lot of work on SDGs, so please, Bahari.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you so much, Alexandro, for the invitation and for the opportunity to share a few words on behalf of UNDESA. So just to put my sort of intervention in context, since 2019, UNDESA, in collaboration with UNFCCC, have been working on this topic of strengthening the synergies between the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement. We have been convening annual dialogues on this. Earlier this year, we announced a dedicated expert group on climate and SDG synergies to take a deeper look at this topic and come up with what does it really mean when we talk about synergistic action? Where are the signs of progress on this? What are the challenges? Where are the barriers? And how can we take this conversation on synergies forward? And as part of that, this expert group launched the first edition of the report this year. It was launched in the margins of the General Assembly in September. So perhaps I can share a few key messages from the work of the expert group. The first key message very much resonates with UNFCCC's statement and, as well as Mr. Cooper's statement, which is the world is facing multiple interconnected crises. The crises of nature, the crises of biodiversity, the crises of climate, and the crises of development. If you look at the Sustainable Development targets, the SDG targets, only 15% of them are on track. And by that, I also include SDG 15, which is the goal on nature, which touches on biodiversity, forests, land degradation, desertification, and issues that we're talking about under these conventions. Some of the targets are actually being reversed for the first time in decades. For example, targets related to child education, child health, targets related to inequality. And of course, on climate change, there is no shortage of data. We all know about the latest evidence on the IPCC, the synthesis report. We are not on track. And so what we need is a shift from siloed approaches to integrated solutions that address multiple challenges at once towards a higher level of impact. And that's what we mean when we say synergy. Now, the numbers are clear. So, for example, 4.3 trillions of dollars are needed to achieve the 1.5 degrees goal by 2030. If we don't take into account the issues of inequality and justice, we will risk 80 million jobs being lost. 84 million people will be at risk of hunger. So we do not have the opportunity to look at these issues from in isolation from one another. Climate change, as we have been hearing for the past 2 weeks, is no longer an issue of, it's not just an issue of GHG reduction, it is an issue of development, it is about inequality, it is about justice. The second point is that the flip side of that is the opportunity that we have. So pursuing the 2030 agenda in concert with the climate goals will lead to better results and more cost-effective solutions. And again, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that. For example, 43 trillions of dollars can be expected in economic gains by 2070 if the SDGs and climate action are aligned. 70% of the SDG targets can be achieved via adaptation measures, and that includes nature-based solutions if they include development co-benefits. 70% of the targets are related. The importance of adaptation, given also that this COP, we haven't heard much about adaptation, is extremely important for development. And the statistics go on. 24 million new jobs in the renewable energy industry by 2030. Again, it's linked directly to people's well-being and economic development. Now, the third point is about if we have the evidence and we know that synergies need to happen, why don't we see them at the scale and speed that is needed? And there is what my colleague Alejandro has mentioned, there is a need for capacity building. Many countries around the world are facing multiple barriers to apply integrated solutions. So let me highlight 3 buckets that our expert group has come up with. The first is the issue of evidence, access to data, knowledge, methodologies that allow policymakers to make informed decisions. While it's important to deepen the evidence base, there's also a disconnect between the interface of evidence, policy, and society. So that gap needs to be addressed, and that includes building the capacity of member states to be able to connect the dots. Second is political issues, and again, this was highlighted in many countries around the world. Different ministries are responsible for different thematic issues. So typically, the Ministry of Environment has the portfolio of climate change, the Ministry of Health deals with health, the Ministry of Finance, economics, and often there is a lack of coordination and coherence in terms of the policies that are designed within these ministries. And that leads to policy incoherence and lack of integrated solutions. So again, the importance of supporting countries and member states to sort of design coordinated and coherent policies that address multiple issues at once. And lastly, perhaps one of the most important issues, finance, right? We hear finance a lot. We've been hearing about it the last 2 weeks. While there is sort of issue of access, there is also an issue of realignment, right? So finance is not going where the most needs are. So realigning the financial system towards where the development and climate and nature needs are is one of the challenges that countries are facing. And again, the importance of capacity building and supporting member states in overcoming all these barriers is critical. And so the last point is that we need all hands on deck to be able to address this topic of going from siloed approaches to integrated solutions. Everybody has a role to play. We do need the scientists, we do need the evidence, and we need the policymakers to turn that evidence into sound policies. And of course, we need society at large to turn the policies into action for society. And that includes civil society, includes the private sector, includes multilateral institutions. From our side, we're committed to do our parts. So we will, first of all, we're delighted to be part of this conversation about on the MA capacity program. We hope to advance discussions further and collaborate with you on that. And broadly on the topic of climate and SDG synergies, there are a number of important milestones. Next year, we will continue to have the annual dialogues. The 5th Global Conference on Climate and SDG Synergies will take place next year. The host and specific date of that is going to be announced shortly. We will continue to deepen the evidence base on this topic. So the 2nd edition of the expert group's report is coming out next year as well, hopefully ahead of the some of the major milestones, such as the Summit of the Future, to inform those political processes. And related to that, we do see momentum around elevating the importance of synergies and integrated solutions to the political level. There are a number of countries who have come together and they're saying we need to talk about integrated solutions at every intergovernmental process, whether it's about the SDGs or COPs or biodiversity or other issues. We do need to connect the dots. And so there are a number of opportunities next year. I will name, for example, the High-Level Political Forum, which is a sort of an intergovernmental process that reviews the SDGs every year. Next year is focused on SDG 13, the goal on climate, so there's an opportunity to look at climate and the other SDGs. There is the Summit of the Future, as I mentioned. That is a moment where the world will look at where are we vis-a-vis progress on all issues related to development and how do we chart a path forward. And of course, as we have heard in this COP, this issue of sort of twinning development, climate, nature will not go away. So COP21, COP29 in Azerbaijan, we will continue to have these sort of dialogues. We typically have a pavilion, the SDG pavilion, where we host events around this topic of synergies. So overall, we invite you to join our sort of efforts. As mentioned by Dr. Cooper, everyone, we need to work together, and we invite all of you to join our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahari, and I think you mentioned a lot of the key concepts. And first of all, thank you for the ongoing collaboration between UNDESA and the Climate Change Secretariat, and we look forward to continuing our engagement in dialogues and hopefully in this joint MEA capacity building program. So you mentioned several key words that I think are relevant for the next presentation on the program, a brief presentation. So integrated solutions, coherence, coordination, connecting the dots, and something that we're looking as a basic principle for this joint capacity building program is that synergies should not be another benefit of a project. Synergies should be completely embedded in projects, because we see often, in my own experience in project development, that, for example, the Green Climate Fund, the Global Environment Facility, there is a bit of, yes, this project is helpful to achieve the goals of one convention, but it can also achieve the goals of the other convention as an added benefit. I think it's more about integrating fully the notion of synergies in project development, policy development. Can I ask my colleagues if, yes, excellent. So this joint MEA capacity building program came about from a discussion amongst the 3 secretariats to what is called the Joint Liaison Group, which is a group that meets regularly to identify collaboration and synergies amongst the Rio Conventions. So it was identified the benefit of establishing such a joint MEA capacity building program. With these main principles: avoid duplication as much as possible, harmonizing actions, going back to Bahari's point, enhancing policy and program coherence, in the sense that the 3 conventions, and it was highlighted by Mr. Cooper and Daniel from the CCD, each convention has their frameworks, their instruments, be it national adaptation plans, NDCs, NBSAPs, the certification NAPs. So each convention has its frameworks and instruments, how to enhance the coordination coherence amongst these instruments. And really the realization of synergies. And Bahari, I think you provided us a good definition of synergies. I don't think we need to go to the point, what is synergies at this point? Synergies are happening. They happen at the project level. And we will hear a very good case study from Grenada on how actually they're happening and how they show the synergistic development conventions. I think it's more about what was said, connecting the dots, bringing to the policy level, and equipping national stakeholders, governments with the tools and capacities to be able to do this. And of course, one of the main principles of this joint capacity building program is sharing of best practices and lessons learned. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are a lot of examples out there from the three conventions on what is working and what can we work better. So those are the main principles. In terms of, if we can have the next slide, please. The objectives, basically very straightforward. Strengthen the capacities of national institutions, individual policymakers to integrate and foster synergies between the Rio Conventions and the SDGs. The key words here are the conventions and the SDG. It's the alignment of these frameworks. And we're looking at, together with partners, because this is something not that the three convention secretariats will do on their own, is through partners to strengthen individual, institutional, and systemic capacities by engaging with relevant partners and providing resource materials. I think the three secretariats have a rich repository of materials, a good understanding of what developing countries are needed through national communications in the case of climate change and the different reportings in the case of the convention. So, and we also aspire to provide insights to national stakeholders on projects, on examples, how to, for improving the wider implementation of the Convention's objectives and the SDGs. So again, it's not, we're going to develop a series of curricular training courses. It's more facilitating actions to build the capacities and maximize the knowledge and expertise already existing in the secretariats, and maximize the interaction with partners like UNDESA and other UN system organizations. So if we go to the next slide, please. So in this sense, we identified, and this is a joint effort by the capacity building, capacity enhancement or development teams of the three secretariats, 5 common themes that should form a bit of the framework for this capacity building program. So it's the synergies themselves at project level. Someone talk about finance, but how you talk about finance? How to finance synergistic projects, how to access finance, how to use other non-traditional instruments. I mean, the three conventions have their financial mechanisms, the Green GF or the GCF, but there are other instruments, so this would be a focus. The tracking progress. The three conventions have their reporting requirements, but how can we help parties or national stakeholders to not to come with a unified reporting, because that's been tried and hasn't worked on, but rather to help them build capacities to be able to track and also match it with the tracking against the SDGs. National development plans, how to integrate synergistic implementation into national development plans, the instruments, the MBSAPs, the NDCs, how to best integrate in national development plans. That goes back to connecting the dots point. A common element in all the three Rio Conventions is local indigenous knowledge, how to ensure that this is recognized and forms an integral part of synergistic implementation. So those are the themes of the joint MEA capacity building program. So if we can go please to the next slide. So those are the generic activity blocks. So training, some level of training, online courses, and regional workshops, again in cooperation with partners. The three secretariats do not have a decentralized structure, but we will work with relevant partners. Create these communities of practice based on the knowledge and data available at the secretariats. And look at, for example, piloting with partners initiatives at the national level. And also engaging other stakeholders in the context of resource mobilization and building these partnerships. And that's complemented by this collaborative implementation notion that we're working with other institutions like UNDESA, country teams, UN country trips, and resident coordinators. I want to mention that this program it's very new. It's still in its conceptual phase, where we're moving into implementation next year, because probably you're aware next year is a particular year because we have Conference of the Parties of the three conventions, something that doesn't happen that often because each convention has their different cycles. So we think it's very timely to be able to show next year in these different spaces at the COPs the capacity, the Joint MEA capacity building program. So if we have a next slide. So, well, that's the timeline. Like I said, we were in the conceptual phase. We launched it in Regional Climate Weeks. Now here, and then early next year, we'll move into the full implementation phase together. Something I want to highlight that this is a very good example already of synergies between the three conventions in terms of three teams in the conventions working together for a joint project. So it's very much appreciated, and I want to also thank our colleagues from the other conventions for their efforts and support. So I think this is the last slide. So this is, well, that's the contact, the heads of the capacity development building units, programs, divisions at the different secretariats, and I want to also thank my colleagues, Richard and Iri, for their collaboration. So this is just a quick overview of the program, and then I want to go to reality and hear from Carissa about how in Grenada they're actually operationalizing the synergies and capturing them as something that's benefiting the three Rio Conventions through the particular initiative. And then hopefully we'll have time later to have a Q&A interactive session. We'd like to hear from participants, particularly what are the main capacity gaps and needs that need to be addressed to implement initiatives benefiting the objectives of the three Rio Conventions. But that will come a bit later. So I will now ask Carissa to share with us your wonderful presentation.
Thanks, Alejandro. Good afternoon, everyone. So I will try to be brief. I will hopefully whet your appetite and know that there will be time for questions, hopefully, afterwards. So next slide, please. So I am going to encourage you to not try to read too much about what you see on the screen. The pictures are more to give you an idea of what we're trying to conceptualize. I'm going to present to you on a current project being implemented in Grenada. It is a GEF project funded from the 6th star allocation, and it is the Climate Resilient Agriculture for Integrated Landscape Management project. It is approximately 3.6 million US, and it has been implemented in Grenada through the government as well as UNDP. And there are 4 components. Broadly, the 4 components focus on institutional capacity, national capacity, resilience, actions on the ground, and knowledge management. Those are the 4 components broadly. Next slide, please. Again, I encourage you not to try to read it. This is just to help you understand a little bit in terms of how this project is synergized, considering all the Rio Conventions as well as the SDGs. So there are elements. We have done a lot of work in Grenada in terms of our policy landscape, and this is by no means the extent of our policy landscape. There are several other documents that could probably be on this screen that there will not be space for. But I focused on the main policy documents as it relates to the 3 Rio Conventions. So for instance, Grenada has done its climate change policy, and it also has its nationally determined contributions, second one, as well as our national adaptation plan. Our climate change policy and our adaptation plan are currently under revision. Under biodiversity, we have our national biodiversity strategy and action plan that will also be revised soon. Under the UNCCD, we do have our land degradation neutrality targets, and it's laid out in our policy document there. And all of that is anchored within our National Sustainable Development Plan, which focuses on the SDGs. So basically, the SDGs that we're focusing on are these 5 here. This project primarily deals with SDG 13 and 15, but we also have elements focusing on, so 13 and 15, as we know, are climate and land, life on land, but we also have elements focusing on gender, so this is a very strong gender focus in this project, in terms of reducing inequalities, as well as life on water, because we live on an island, and on an island it's very difficult to separate ecosystems. So what happens on land affects what happens in the water very quickly, and we know this. So this is kind of a conceptualization of how the project builds on the elements and the target areas of the various conventions based on our policy framework. Next slide, please. So in terms of our successes, and in some ways this is very conceptual based on the policy documents. We'll talk a little bit about the challenges that we've had in this. But Grenada has done a lot of work in attempting to synergize actions. And so for instance, I mean, climate change is bigger. We do have like a National Climate Change Committee. We have, and that committee focuses on the overarching policy synergies and ensuring that we have some leadership at the policy level in terms of what we do. And of course, there are cross-pollinations between biodiversity and land degradation, land management, because these directly impact climate as well. When we come down to the action level, we do have a climate change focal point network. That network includes all the sectors that are involved in our nationally determined contribution, as well as our NAP. So it means that all the energy, forestry, on mitigation side, and others. When we come to the adaptation side, there is agriculture, health, even data. All these, the various ministries and entities dealing with these subjects are actually part of a committee that is intended to meet. We have a MEA's coordination committee that is supposed to meet on a regular basis to help beyond just the Rio Conventions, all MEAs, because there are going to be other aspects that apply to what we're doing in these main 3 Rio Conventions. And then, of course, there are always going to be ad hoc institutions. So, for example, every time we have a project, projects have ad hoc committees set up specifically to deal with the subject matter in that project. Sometimes we've had situations where we have more than one project that require similar personnel, and so you'll have one project committee for several projects, for instance. In addition to that, as I already mentioned, in our policies, our national policies, there is a lot of cross-pollination of themes, and all of this is anchored within our NSDP, that's National Sustainable Development Plan. And so in that way, we've tried to lay out a landscape where we are trying to synergize in what we are doing. And so in addition to all of that, when we are designing projects, consultation, stakeholder engagement, not just in the implementation of the project, but even at the design phase, when we're conceptualizing projects, etc., we try to bring as many voices to the table, and that includes not just public sector, but also the private sector, as well as the communities and beneficiaries at the local level. So that is the goal, and as best as possible, we try to implement that. Next slide, please. However, there will always be challenges, this is not at all an exhaustive list. This is probably just a synopsis of some of the big ones that we would face. We could start with the lack of, or the need for technical personnel. We live on a small island, and it's been raised. I mean, we're sitting in a capacity building hub, so if you've attended some of the sessions over the days, you would hear that as a regular theme, and it's not just actually having persons with technical capacity, so it's not just attracting them, but keeping them. Because the challenge is that you may attract them, but then they may come on a project basis, a contract basis, they disappear, you have to start over with the capacity building, etc. And it's not just within public sector, so again, because we are on a small island, sometimes it's difficult to attract capacity or find capacity within the general public. So we find ourselves often having to bring persons in, external persons in, who do not understand the island context. I think many of us who are from small islands who are here would realize that having the conversations with people to conceptualize what life is like on a small island versus living in a larger country. Yes, we are all vulnerable, but the vulnerabilities are quite acute and different in small islands as opposed to any other country developing or developed. In red, we're just trying to highlight, some opportunities for how we can address some of these capacity gaps and needs. And so there is a need for extensive training to increase the technical abilities and to develop local capacity, local technical capacity and expertise, so that we can sustain action over a period of time. There are gaps that remain in data. We've often found that data collection tends to be project-driven, which isn't always part of a national framework. And so even when you have loads of data, sometimes it's not comparable because the methodologies are different, et cetera. And even just ensuring that you have sufficient data in various areas, that can also be a challenge. So we know that, and we have tried, and it's something that we're working on in terms of how we design and operationalize data management systems that go beyond projects, that they are institutionalized within the public sector, and regardless of what is coming in, they're using one standardized system that you have to plug into so that we'll be able to utilize that. But again, that means additional capacity. So we need to be training, we need support to develop these systems and ensure that we're able to anchor them within the framework we already have. In terms of the institutional arrangements, I presented some lovely ideas. We've had challenges in implementing that, again, as you lose capacity regularly and always having to be replacing, or even when the capacity is lost, there's a gap in the period of time within which they are replaced. So that is always going to be a challenge. And one of the things that could really support with this is a capacity building plan that is not project specific, that is long term, that allows us to say, okay, this is the capacity we have now, this is the capacity we need to have at point B, and how we would get there over a period of time, and to account for some of these challenges that would result in terms of losing capacity on because the turnover in staff can be quite high in some of these instances. And finally, just to say that the knowledge management aspect is a very key part of capacity building. If your whole of society has bought into some of these concepts, it is easier to roll out not just project implementation, but also in terms of programming, planning, at the planning phase, et cetera. If there's an understanding, because we try to engage society as a whole, then it would be good to ensure that we have consistent and sustained training, capacity building, knowledge sharing, et cetera, so that we'll be able to ensure that all stakeholders know their roles and their responsibilities. They see their spaces, and they know how to engage in those spaces so that they can better contribute to the process. I think I'll stop there and hand back over to Alejandro. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carisha, for the wonderful presentation. And I think it's important that you highlighted first that it makes sense to pursue an synergistic approach based on the structures you described, but there's still those capacity gaps and needs. And that's exactly what we hope we can help address with this joint MEA capacity building program. Now I would like to maybe open the floor for the last part of this event. We still have, I mean, the good thing is we have this room, so there's no pressure for the room, but I would like to hear from the audience, particularly because we heard from the experience of a small island development state, which is very particular, it's very own context, so maybe we'd like to hear from others, from other country representatives or institutions, what are the main capacity gaps and needs in your context that need to be addressed to be able to implement these synergistic implementation approaches between the conventions and with the SDGs? Or if you have a particular question to Carissa or colleagues from the convention. So now we'll open the floor. Please just raise your hand and introduce yourself. We have a mic that we can pass around. Oh, I see in the back. So I don't know, colleagues, I think we have from the adaptation committee, if I remember correctly.
Thank you. I'm Karina Barrera. I'm the Undersecretary of Climate Change of Ecuador and the representative of the Adaptation Committee. I have both hats here. So one of the main issues now, trying to imagine what is going to happen in the transition, is what are the new capacities that we have to develop for the future. For example, in adaptation, maybe as part of the adaptation committee, we have some documents that are good tools to develop, but as a government level. However, when we want to to make capacities or to develop capacities, in a specific levels, private sector or financial sector. Maybe the tools needs to be more specific, and we have to connect the concepts with new tools and new actors. What is the strategy that you are imagining in order to engage to the new actors? The language for the convention is too complex and sometimes it's not so attractive for the real actors in the real life. What is the most of the population and who are going to make the transition in the real life? How to connect this? Thanks.
Thank you very much for that question. I see, Daniel, that you may want to intervene, but if you don't mind, Daniel, we have a question there in the back, and then maybe we can come back to you. There, the gentleman.
Yes, thank you very much, Mauricio Luna from NAP Global Network, ISD. First, congratulations for this work from the 3 conventions. And my question is very specific. Throughout the last 2 weeks of this COP, I've heard several times from countries we support how there is a consultation fatigue for different processes. We have, NDCs, then we have NAPs, we have soon MBSAPs, and so on. So I'm wondering, this is a wider kind of view question, how this might contribute to consultations that are that bring different stakeholders that we all need to consult in a more holistic way. So we don't have to ask the same people several times during the same year, but actually capture what we need for different conventions and different planning processes at the same time. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll give the floor to Daniel, and maybe I can provide my inputs to the previous interventions.
Thank you very much. This was very, very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask, I know the example of Namibia where they try to institutionalize the synergies of the 3 conventions, for example, under one ministry. I think sometimes it needs initiative of the government. I think Bahari was talking about this challenge, for example, is one of them is capacity building. What is your real challenge to bring these 3 Rio Conventions in under one government structure to come up with one report, for example? We have the UNCCD example, for example. We do this national drought plans, but also on LDN, and we are trying to bring them together. I think we are on the right track to do that because we have to show them that it is possible. It's also in their interest, this benefit. So I just wanted to hear from you what the real challenge is. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that I'm putting you on the spot, Rita. Please.
Yeah, I was just sitting here thinking, that's way above my pay grade. Because, for instance, in the Grenada experience, we have had configurations of the government that had all conventions, their focal points under one ministry. Actually, I believe when this project was developed, all convention focal points sat under one ministry, and that supported the synergies of it. But what we try to do when we're doing consultations, so like I said, when we start consultations for project design, we do bring to the table everyone. So it is not that we're doing a climate change project, so only persons that we see relevant for climate change are in the room. No, we bring together persons from biodiversity, from the UNCCD focal point, all the areas, they have an opportunity to have a say. And it is often at that stage they will say, oh, we're doing something similar, or we are planning something similar, can we collaborate? So it helps when everybody's around the table at the same time, but I think at the back in terms of stakeholder fatigue, in terms of consultation, that is a real thing, and I think part of the challenge is that the time it takes to develop projects, and as we have all the capacity constraints, etc., because of course that has implications for the speed with which you can develop the project and implement the project. We find, and I've heard it quite a few times, sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years to develop a project. The needs on the ground have changed by the time the project is ready to be implemented. But more so, the stakeholders you're going to engage haven't seen anything happen since the last time you engaged them, and now you're coming to engage them again. So the stakeholder fatigue part of it is a real component, and so but it helps when everybody's sitting around the table and you're able to say, this is what we plan, this is what we have, because sometimes what you can plan is very specific to what the funds will allow. And so you have to see how you can penetrate different aspects. And what we try to do in Grenada is build upon, so if we're doing something in one area, try not to duplicate that, build on it, or pick up another aspect, because it's very rare that we say we need 3 things done and one project will fund the 3 things. We may have to do one thing under project 1, one thing under project 2, one thing under project 3. And so having those regular meetings is what helps to alleviate some of those challenges. It's why we try to set up some of the coordinating mechanisms that we have. But as I said, as we continue to lose capacity and have to keep rebuilding that capacity, it does put a bit of a challenge on that. I hope I've answered the question. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris. I think that those are very useful insights from real life practice. And maybe just to add to my own 5 cents to the previous question, I think, Karina, you raised a very important point in terms of all the jargon we use and translate that and how to engage stakeholders, even between the conventions, the acronyms themselves. So I think, and that's one aspect that I think is maybe something we can tackle to this joint capacity building program, to create materials that explain the different instruments in an easy to understand way, not only for the external public, for the same people dealing with the conventions, because in a country like Grenada, probably the focal points are sharing, the same person is doing focal point for the 2 or 3 conventions. But in other countries, it's most complex, because you have different divisions, biodiversity divisions, forestry, etc. So I think it's how you package that understanding, and it goes back to the point of consultations. Sometimes we tend, let's do a consultation first, and then continue, and then as is what you said, I mean, fatigue of stakeholders. So maybe it's combined with a base of information, a common base of information that allows you to maybe focus a consultation. So just some insights there. Anyone else would like to share, or please go ahead.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. My name is Lulu Hayenga. I come from Kenya, and mine is just a question for just clarity to understand. It might be rather simplistic or not. I can engage in bilateral explanations later. I was very interested in all the presentations. And I just say well done to all of you, all 3 of you. This one is for mainly for my sister from Grenada, Dr. Hobson. I know you had mentioned the institutional arrangements as a challenge. I have a question regarding when you look at the conventions that we have chosen to focus on. Do you find that as a complete synergy to deal with, or should we add some more? Or should we add one to be in the alternative? Because I don't know how some of the conventions are going to affect some of the countries. And then secondly, to ask about when you're dealing, maybe as a government, you're dealing with marine special planning on one side and land use planning on another side, synergetically with these conventions. Would you be able to walk us through that if you wish? And if not, I can ask later. Okay, thank you.
Okay, again, you're on the spot.
I think Alejandro owes me a coffee after this. And thank you for speaking the Dr. Hobson into manifesting that. I'll hold on to that and try to get there. Whether or not we can be talking about adding additional MEAs, I think it's an interesting question to explore. My response to that would be that for us in Grenada, we do try to look at all the MEAs in its totality. But these 3 conventions are the biggest ones. Most of our targets, environmental targets are incorporated in these three. So for us, it has always been the three biggest focuses. But we do, so for example, CITES, all the other conventions, we do have focal points for them and we do try to coordinate. But you do find jumping off points from these three. So I think the three Rio Conventions really do. And then when you package that with the SDGs, you kind of bring everybody on board. So, and that's what we did in our National Sustainable Development Plan. So our National Sustainable Development Plan incorporates all of these, all the MEs, all that exist, as well as all the other health, education, or everything is incorporated into that National Sustainable Development Plan. So everything is anchored within that as our policy document in Grenada. In terms of, for example, so you spoke about blue economy, oceans, marine spatial planning, etc. Again, and it may be a different circumstance because Grenada is so small, and you meet people in the corridors anyway, because everyone is around the table, and many of us wear several hats. So for instance, when we started doing blue economy in Grenada, it was anchored within the ministry that was doing climate resilience. So there was already that cross-pollination. They are now in separate ministries. To go back to your first question, unfortunately, ministry constructs are a political thing. I don't know how we change that political beast because we cannot change governments, really. So if we're going to talk about that conversation, then we can talk about how we marry portfolios in a better way. But so right now they're in different ministries. And again, the reason why we do a lot of the coordinating mechanisms is because we have to speak across ministries, and the government structure isn't such that you could just go across the door and say we do something together. You kind of have to go up, go across, and then go back down. So we set up structures to allow us to have that that ability to talk to each other and plan together. And of course, there is the aspect of the challenges with those structures, but the idea and the intention is there through the creation of those structures. Yeah.
Thanks, Carisha. Maybe the last one, because then we have there in the back.
Thank you. Gillian Bowser from Colorado State University in the United States. I just had a question on process. So you notice in the global goals on adaptation that were released, there are many ecosystem references and references to biodiversity in the current draft text. Is there a vision on how the conventions work together on the negotiation process itself? I mean, I know that the UN bodies are responsible for the process, not for the negotiations, but then we have decision texts that come out that don't necessarily marry with each other. And a good example is if you look at the current text that is out, they call out the IPCC, but they don't call out the decision texts that were critical for biological diversity. I work as an ecologist, so we don't see that cross language, or even if there's a common tour, terms of reference to biological loss in one convention versus the next, so that the process is consistent. So I don't know if you can clarify on that, but what is the process that the three conventions can work on to help negotiation such that it is captured within the work programs of the different conventions? Thank you.
Thanks. I think that's a complex question. Yeah, at the end of the day, these are party-driven processes in the three conventions. So one could argue that it's the parties that lead that coherence amongst the conventions. We at the Secretariats, of course, we follow the developments in each of the conventions and focus mostly on the outcomes. It would be quite challenging to follow the individual processes because they are a bit different. The process in CBD in terms of decision making is a bit different than what's at the CCD and the COP, the UNFCCC. So I see your point, it's a very valid point, but in reality it's quite complex because it's very fluid. And you know how negotiations are, how probably the targets from the GGA came about, it's almost like a last minute deal. So it would be hard to cross references and this type of thing. So, but it's a very valid point, thank you. Daniel.
I think I can just add to that, maybe this can also be more relevant next year when we have these three Rio Conventions COP in the same year, and it's one following after the other. What we try to do, at least from the experience, is trying to look into the COP decisions from CBD, for example, which happened just before us, and trying to advise the parties that this is happening. So we try to draft some decisions when they allow, but as I think Alejandro said, this is party-driven, but trying to make sure that at least they are aware of what has happened, relevant to what they want to decide in our issue. So we try to look into this, but at the end of the day, I think it's the parties. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Maybe if there's no any other question, thank you very much to our audience, to our panelists, Daniel, Carissa, and well, Bahari already left, but also Dr. Cooper. Thank you very much, and thank you. Thanks to our audience to be here in the last days of COP for such an event. Really appreciate it, and of course we will post information on how this joint capacity building program evolves, and probably you will be hearing more about it. Thank you so much, and have a nice afternoon.